Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Warm welcome to this panel, which is dedicated to the topic of Ukraine's European integration and potential accession. This will be a truly hybrid panel with 2 in-person participants and 2 speakers joining us as online. And I am delighted to introduce our distinguished speakers today. First, Hanna Hopko, a foreign policy expert, former member of the Verkhovna Rada and its chairwoman of its Foreign Affairs Committee between 2014 and 2019. Hanna, welcome. We will be also joined by Viola Cramon-Taubadel, a member of the European Parliament, of its Foreign Affairs Committee, also member of the delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee, and a former EU policy speaker of the Green Caucus in the German Bundestag. Also, Philipp Albrecht, who is already with us, co-president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and András Rácz, associate fellow in the German Council on Foreign Relations. And my name is Hegedűs. I work as transatlantic fellow for the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and it's my utmost pleasure to be able to moderate this meeting today. Just very briefly about the housekeeping rules. So we will start with a moderated discussion on the topic of Ukraine's European prospects in approximately 45 to 50 minutes. And then we will open up a public Q&A. So I would like to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to prepare your questions because you will definitely have the opportunity to address them to our distinguished speakers. Since the 24th of February, Ukraine has been fighting a historic war for its independence, for its statehood, for its right to self-determination, and also for its sheer existential survival against the Russian aggression. And I think it would be an understatement to say that this war changed many things in Europe. But it definitely changed the European Union's relations with Ukraine. The country is not part of the association trio anymore. As a matter of fact, no such thing as association trio exists. The Ukrainian government applied for EU membership on February 28, and on the 23rd of June, the European Council granted Ukraine a candidate status in the European Union. And I'm convinced that this is more than just a symbolic move, because Ukraine's European integration is practically unfolding before our very eyes at a rather fast pace. Ukraine entered a completely custom-free trade relationship with the European Union, so practically the free movement of goods is already achieved, even if officially only for a temporal period. Ukraine became connected to the European electricity grid and electricity market, and the European Commission is contemplating with the idea how Ukraine could become also part of the roaming-free European telecommunication zone. So Ukraine's European integration is not a matter for the future, but it's unfolding in these present days. However, we also know from the experiences in the Western Balkans that EU geopolitical interests may fade, that reform enthusiasm of candidate countries may weaken, and that political fatigue can paralyze accession processes. And against that background, I would like to ask you to start with a sort of reality check, perhaps. And the same question to all of our speakers would be first that what is, according to your opinion, a both desirable but also realistic and feasible scenario for Ukraine's European integration in the next 5 years? And what should the European Union, its member states, and Ukraine do and achieve to realize the scenario you desire? And potentially we could start with you, Ms. Hopko.
Thank you so much for organizing this important discussion. And I think really historical event happened this June when Ukraine received a candidate status. And I remember in May and June, when we traveled within our International Center for Ukrainian Victory to key capitals, Berlin, Paris, The Hague, also Brussels, to convince the decision makers that granting Ukraine a candidate status does not contradict the enlargement process of the Western Balkans, because all countries will be equal in this process, and Ukraine met the criteria, so actually we deserve, not just because of Russian full-scale escalation, but also because the reforms we implemented after the Euromaidan dignity revolution, it's also very convincing just to grant us the EU candidacy, candidate status. And it also was a geopolitical signal to Russian Federation and to Kremlin, which also determine Ukraine's victory in Russian aggression, weapon supply, sanctions, and EU perspective, and I do hope also NATO after Ukrainian victory. It's also not just symbolic, but it's also one of the key elements of our victory. And also behind the Russian war against Ukraine and actually Putin's attempt to return Ukraine back in Russian sphere of influence, given a European perspective, just reaffirmed that EU is a geopolitical player, which is, I think, really important for European Union to be positioned not just economic union. And actually today, Ukrainians are united and mobilized as never before, and 91% of the population support the EU integration. 93% of Ukrainians believe and confident that Ukraine is winning the war, and the victory in Ukraine's view is full restoration of territorial integrity and sovereignty in the internationally recognized borders 1991. So Ukrainians are fighting, risking and giving their lives to remain independent country with European values. And I think it's really important that we are defending not just the independence of Ukraine, but also we are contributing to global, I would say, security, not just preventing the devastation going beyond Ukrainian borders, and not allowing authoritarian regime to attack in hybrid warfare methods. So, and also, if we discuss about, you already mentioned roaming and others. So Ukraine is already deeply integrated into the EU internal market. 63% of the objectives under the association agreement completed. Ukraine has proven that it is able to proceed with sectoral integration at the accelerated pace, even in time of Russian full-scale war genocide. So you mentioned ENSUI, energy system. So after I think also it's very important that Ukraine join in the European continental energy grid, and especially with what's happening now with nuclear terror, when Russian military forces are in the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and recent attacks on Yuzhno-Ukrainska nuclear power plant. So it's a terror, nuclear terror, and we are advocating. I just came back from Washington, D.C. I visited last week with the idea, with the key goals to recognize Russian aggression as a genocide and designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. And after today's decision of Putin, he needs 300,000 more soldiers to die for what? What does Russia stand for? Just to be killed for what is the biggest idea of this? So I think Putin lost Ukraine, and this higher level of support, 91% of the population for EU integration, it's also important. Also, let's mention the trade and economy, new market and business for the EU, and as a guarantor of food security to European states, we really fight very tough to deblocade the Black Sea and demilitarize, because grain deal is a just partial solution. It's not a real solution in long term. And I'm sure that Ukraine, with around 32 million hectares of land, with almost 24% of all EU arable land, it really could become a global security or food security guarantor, which is really important. And Green Deal, climate change, everyone is talking here. But I made also, there were also discussion today in the morning about the role of renewables in helping democracy to counter the fossil fuel authoritarian regime and what is happening now with energy crisis in EU, which Russia provoked, because the weaponization of energy with gas, and we were fighting against the Nord Stream 2 for many years. So it's really important that Ukraine with renewable Ukraine has a higher potential for renewables, and potential also increased to 70% by 2050. So there are many other facts where we could say that Ukraine, as a not candidate state, but in the nearest future as a member of the EU, it's will be, how to say, for both sides. So we will strengthen the EU as a also spiritual or basket of Europe, not just it used to be in last century a food basket of Europe, but also as a values defender, also as a security, because Ukraine armed forces are de facto European armed forces. And it's really important that we will share our unique practical experience in conventional war and hybrid warfare. So the plan of Ukrainian president, our government with Vice Prime Minister Olga Stefanishyna, after candidate status, to implement 7 commitments and all legislation, and to, how to say, to progress, that after candidate status, the membership will not take, like for other countries, decades. And I think it's in the interest of both Ukraine and the European Union, because I do believe that European Union becoming a geopolitical player, it's in the interest of democracy, democracy sustainability in long term.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hopko. Mr. Albrecht, where do you see Ukraine's accession process in 5 years, and what do you think which goals can be realistically achieved in a mid-term, approximately 5 years long period? You have the floor.
First of all, let me thank you very much for the invitation and the occasion to speak about this very important question, not only for Ukraine, but for the European Union and the Western partners in general, because we have to first and foremost achieve that there is a clear alliance uphold to support the Ukrainian people in their struggle in this war, but also to open up perspectives on how we build up a new era of a common interest policy area, including Ukraine, in several fields. And I think if you ask like for what's desirable and realistic, then I think it's important to say that we need to have quick progress in many areas in order to foster not only the support for also the Ukrainian economy, which is needed, and the integration, for example, of the energy infrastructure into the European infrastructure, but also in order to really build up a common understanding of how to integrate our policy decisions in this new era. And that means that we need to accelerate in some areas the accession procedure, and to also make it possible to already agree on common standards and apply them even before the full membership is fully enabled, but to also not forget that the whole procedure, of course, needs to be brought forward in a quick manner, and that the clear aim and agreement is the full membership of Ukraine in the European Union. And that is what has to lead us in the upcoming time, where we all know that, of course, there is still work to be done in several areas. And that means also, by the way, on both sides, because also inside the European Union, the change of situation in which we all are requires for new reform attempts, especially in the field of foreign and security policy, but also in many economic issues. We see the dependencies on the energy market, which we have to address commonly. We see the necessity to not only look at our approach towards Russia, but also the question, how do we deal with other dependencies arising, like vis-a-vis China? And we have to also address in parallel necessary reforms which are equally important, like, for example, the energy transition and many transformation questions we have to answer. And in this regard, the chance of this accelerated accession procedure is also to already build up new mechanisms and also build up maybe a new level of integration in the European Union, and therefore achieve also added value for the European partners and for the people in the European Union with this accession procedure of Ukraine. That is what I think would be most desirable, but also possible and realistic, which means, of course, also that we have to look on other accession procedures we have to handle in parallel, for example, on the Western Balkans, also Georgia. So we have to look at the whole region, which we are looking at the moment, where influence is taking place, also in various ways from different parts of the world, and we have to face that commonly as Europeans, and that includes the view of the Ukrainian people. And therefore, I think one of the next and the most important steps on this procedure is also to achieve a political integration in the way how we discuss together these challenges and the approaches towards our partners, towards the economic and energy questions, and that we try to get these debates, which we are having right now here, also into the capitals of the European Union member states and into the European institutions, in order to strengthen and deepen dialogue on the very important perspectives Ukraine is bringing into the European decision-making processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Albrecht, and thank you, Ms. Cramon, for joining our panel. We are conducting a reality check of Ukraine's EU aspirations, and the central question is, what is both a feasible and realistic goal for this integration process in the next 5 years? But potentially I will also add a further question to that for you, and that is that based on all of the lessons learned from the Western Balkan, how can the European Union keep the credibility of the integration process alive? And how can the European Union act in a responsible way to act disillusionment in Ukraine sooner or later, which will kick in if there will be not sufficient progress in the accession procedure? Thank you so much, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all the other panelists who have already spoken, Jan Philipp and Hanna. I mean, there was a lot of input regarding the integration process for Ukraine. And I think one has to be honest, without the war, there would not be this immediate chance for Ukraine to ever get or to ever receive this candidate status at that moment. I mean, this is clear. I would say the European Union actually reacted much faster, much more swiftly, much more smarter than we have expected, let's say, the beginning of the war. So I think that especially Ursula von der Leyen and we in the European Parliament understood perfectly that we have to act as a geopolitical player. I mean, you see now how Putin tries to interfere and tries to create this fake referendum to make sure you create facts. And even I was at the beginning very, let's say, skeptical whether this EU integration process would be a doable solution and would be also for the European Union or for us in the parliament something we should really lobby for. Well, I see that at the moment we need to win the war, we need to send weapons, we have to look after IDPs and refugees and all the other things related to the war. But now I think, and we have to support this EU integration process, as Jan said, in a parallel track. We really need to see that we try to bring the Ukraine plus the Western Balkan states into the European Union as fast as possible. But Daniel, you're absolutely right. It is a merit-based process, and even after the reforms were implemented and after the criteria were fulfilled and the criteria or expectations were met, the EU has not delivered when it came to the Western Balkans, and there is a huge frustration. And when you look through the long-term service, especially in some of the countries of the Western Balkans, the expectation or the so-called pro-Western, pro-European, pro-EU attitude in the wider or broader population is increasingly or is significantly decreasing. And that is extremely worrying. So we have to find ways how, without switching off the merit-based process, but at least with keeping our promises, we can kick back in. As we actually promised in 2003. That was something, I guess, where high expectations were raised, where a lot of people thought, okay, if we go one reform after the other, even if we go some steps back, but there is a realistic way. And especially in those countries, such as North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and so on, you have seen significant reforms or progress, and still the door is not really open and it was not really speed up, and the situation was stuck. How to prevent this from happening, how to avoid that? I would say, even as I said, I was rather skeptical, was rather critical at the beginning with Ukraine. I would very much lobby for integrating Ukraine as fast as we can, as swiftly as we can. I mean, we have a lot of very reliable partners in Ukraine. We had a lot of very strong NGOs. We have players like Hanna and many others. We have very good councillors on the local level, on the municipal level, in the cities. I heard, for example, we had a extremely good, well-attended Ukraine event last night, somewhere out here in Lower Saxony, not far away from where Mr. Albrecht came from. And you know, the first thing people ask me, but how is it with corruption? Everyone who has been to Ukraine is kind of addicted to how do we solve this problem? And so my intention is to say, yes, we will give, during the reconstruction process, a lot of money to Ukraine. But believe me, it is in our interest. It is in the interest of the people of Ukraine. It is in the interest of many people in Ukraine that we allocate the money where it is supposed to go, where it is needed, and so on. So, I mean, it must be in the interest of the Ukrainian government, of the municipal governors and councillors and mayors and so on, to make sure that we have a transparent process in that, and that the credibility also from the Ukrainian side is really safeguarded by a transparent, process, by some external monitors and people like this. So I would be very optimistic, at least for this window of opportunity, to make sure to get Ukraine into the first phase or first steps. But for me, still at the moment, it is the priorities is for the hardware and to make sure that Ukraine can win this war and will get this or can liberate the territory. But you're absolutely right. The dilemma and the failures we have done with the Western Balkan state for quite some time, where especially now Mr. Vučić, together with Edi Rama, try to create an alternative track, try to create something regional, some new cooperation, but without values, without standards, without EU accession aspiration, but rather to make sure that they do not rely on the EU. And this should not happen, of course, with Ukraine. And we should also make an effort to get the Western Balkans back on track as soon as possible. I would limit it to that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cramon, for your insights. And András, what are the conclusions of your reality check? Especially, Ms. Cramon mentioned several times that obviously the real short-time priority should be Russia's military defeat. What do you think? How can a candidate status perspective contribute to Ukrainian war efforts? And how illusionary to be appear accession expectations from a down-to-earth frontline perspective?
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and see Hanna again, despite of the war. Kind of a remark in the beginning, everything that I'm going to say here constitutes solely and exclusively my own personal opinion. So it shall not be taken as an official position of any institution, country, or any other entity. And Dani, you made my life a lot easier by giving this 5 years time perspective. Because if you look at the 5 years, Mr. Putin's decision, not today, actually yesterday, it was just only televised today, but the decision was taken yesterday already. This decision, by mobilizing at least 300,000 reservists, we will see how many of them will be deployed and in what time frame. And we will also see whether this is the last mobilization or there will be another one after this 300,000 will be neutralized. But still, this decision made sure that the war is going to last for quite a while more. At least a year more, but perhaps even more. So to think about Dani's time frame of 5 years, at least 1 more year is already taken by the war, but probably more. And when it comes to Ukraine's EU integration in terms of membership, dear colleagues, just remember the Copenhagen criteria. And don't ask me about the membership perspectives. We have a person in the room, former Commissioner Peter Balázs, who knows everything inside out about how a membership negotiation takes place. I'm just a plain military analyst, nothing else. But just think for a second. The third Copenhagen criteria implies that the country trying to join the European Union has to be ready to meet the demands of the European Union once you are inside, absorption capacity. Can you imagine the Ukrainian economy being able to stand the free trade competition on the European market, even 5 years from now? I mean, if you ask me to be realistic, that's what I'm doing. I really don't see that Ukraine in 5 years, even if all the institutional aspects could be checkmarked, I really don't see that Ukrainian economy would be ready to meet the third Copenhagen criteria. Not to mention things like functioning democracy, functioning economy. Dear colleagues, Ukraine is at war, state of war. And if you're in a state of war, it's absolutely normal in a state of war to suspend opposition parties, to ban opposition parties, to ban critical media that might serve the enemy. coming out from a state of war, it's not like switching the light on and off. If you spend a year in a state of war, it has a massive damage on the institutional systems of democracy. You cannot restore a functioning multi-party system in just like this when the war comes to an end, whenever that happens. So we need to be really realistic about the perspectives, not to mention the economic and infrastructural and human aspects. Ukraine lost significant part of its economy in the war. 20% of the territory occupied, most of the heavy industry is already destroyed, the rest is in the process of being destroyed by Russia's military strikes. This is not something that you can fix in 5 years' time. And by the way, no country has ever made it in 5 years. No Central and Eastern European country. So we need to be realistic about the perspectives. And of course, from the political perspective, I fully agree. We need to speak about the perspective of a long-term full membership. But when it comes to a 5 years time period, we need to be realistic about expectations. And here comes the good news. Do you remember Romano Prodi and his famous motto about neighborhood policy? Everything but the institutions. We can give everything but the institutions. And personally, I think that this is the direction we shall go to in the next 5 years. Because institutional membership, even if that ever happens, it should not going to happen in 5 years' time. And by the way, just imagine how the accession of Ukraine, a country of 40 million, how the accession of Ukraine would turn power relations inside the EU completely upside down. Do we really see the support for that inside the EU in 5 years' time? I don't. But if we approach the problem from the perspective like everything but the institutions, we need to do the best we can. And I fully agree with what Hanna said. The EU finally turned out to be a geopolitical actor, and the EU is faring pretty well. If anybody would have told me a year ago that Ukraine would get the candidate status, that the EU would adopt 7th packages of sanctions against the Russians in less than 6 months' time, if you would ever told me, anybody a year ago, that the European Union will finance weapons deliveries to an ongoing conflict from EU money, because this is happening, I wouldn't have believed a single bit of it. So the EU's approach and the EU's policies are changing and changing for the better. But what it takes to become a member, it's an institutionalized legal process. There is no shortcut. You have to meet all the requirements, you have to adopt the laws, you have to implement the laws, you have to monitor the whole process, and it's a long, long bumpy road. It has been a long bumpy road even for such countries which were not torn apart by Russia's aggression. So if we focus on the logic of everything but the institutions, the first task is to keep Ukraine in the fight and help Ukraine winning the war. This requires immense amount of money, effort, resilience from our side, and also the readiness to take up the hardships that are awaiting us. Because Ukrainians are fighting in the trenches, dying in the trenches, and we keep doing so for quite a while. But our population will also suffer, particularly during the coming winter. Quite likely also the next winter. So this is not a free lunch for us either. We need to keep up the popular support also inside the EU to keep supporting Ukraine. Remember, everything but the institutions, immense amounts of money, immense amounts of political support. We need to move forward with the sanctions regime as well. If there is one or more EU government that would block the adoption of upcoming sanctions, no problem. Right now, the most important thing to be done with the sanctions is actually to patch the holes in the sanctions regimes, because there are quite many holes in the implementation of the sanctions. So even without adopting a 7th or 8th or 10th sanctions package, there is still a lot that we could do, for example, when it comes to export control and dual-use technologies and things like this. So immense amount of financial support, political support, economic support, because in 5 years' time, the biggest task in the relation of Ukraine and the EU will not be the EU membership. It will be the reconstruction. In 5 years from now, hopefully, the EU will be one of the biggest donors of Ukraine's reconstruction. And about the amounts we are talking here, estimates vary. And of course, you cannot really fully fathom the situation on the Russian-occupied territories. But even the lowest estimates are around $800 billion, and the war is not yet over. So this is really a long-term commitment, long run from our side as well. And here I'm finishing with the good news. Another good news, see? The good news here is that whatever the final objective is, full membership, or something like the situation of Norway, which is institutionally not a member, but fully integrated to the single market, to visa-free, basically all the four freedoms apply to Norway, is just not a member. Whichever will be the final direction, full membership whenever it happens, or some kind of a very closed economic infrastructural integration but without institutional membership, the road towards that is largely the same. In the next 5 years, we need to do basically the same regardless of what the final outcome is. So for the next 5 years, I think these are the perspectives. And yes, of course, we need to maintain the support for European integration and approximation, both inside the Ukrainian population, but also in our populations. And that's going to be quite a challenge. So if you want me to do a reality check, this is my reality check. I hope it helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, András. And as a matter of fact, you raised the issue of incremental integration. And that was also a proposal made by the European Stability Initiative for the European Commission, just to follow the blueprint of the Norway model, but without direct financial payments from the Ukraine, practically paying for the access to the internal market. And against that background, I would like to ask you, Ms. Hopko, what would be the Ukrainian perception of such political developments? How desirable could such a model be for Ukraine, that instead of having a full-fledged representation within the European institution, the country could have potentially, even in a shorter period of time, access, but a full access to the EU internal market and all of the four freedoms?
Thank you so much for this question. So Ukraine is a member of European family. The question is when we will become a member of the European Union. So, and it's like during the period when we were advocated for candidate status, there are many ideas to give us like how to say hybrid version, like remember potential candidate status for candidate status and others. We refused, and we campaigned for a candidate status and not to how to say invent a new hybrid reality within the EU institutional and procedure regulations. How to say like regulations. Yes. So this is why here I also wanted to remind you that in 2019, together with my colleague who is sitting now here, Oksana Yuranets, she used to be the member of Euro Integration Committee. So we incorporated into the constitution of Ukraine a strategic goal for Ukraine to become a full-fledged member of EU and NATO. So there is no options like you mentioned and others, like desirable, not desirable. There is Ukrainian constitution. As a former legislator, I could say that we have to stick what's written and what is incorporated into the constitution. So I think this is the way to go. And let me also use this opportunity to express our gratitude for the tremendous support, immense financial and also political, and especially on the people's level in different EU countries, because I travel a lot within these 7 months, and I see the reaction of people support, helping Ukrainian, I wouldn't even say refugees, but Ukrainian IDPs and others. So this is really, we are very thankful, and we know that this is a marathon, and strategic patience and support and this empathy is key to counter attack Russian hybrid warfare, because it's a war against also Western civilization, not just a genocide against Ukraine. So, and I agree also that accession. So now we are talking about wartime and how to respond all destroyed heating system, water supply, and prepare for winter in Ukraine. It's like a relief during wartime. But then there will be different stages, and post-victory agenda includes reconstruction, and also EU integration process is also, with all reforms we have to adopt and to continue, like judiciary and others. It's really important also to see EU investment in rebuilding Ukraine. And I think this will be also in common interest and with all transparency, accountability mechanisms, because trust is a key. Trust inside Ukraine, because people are suffering a lot. People are dying. Of course, they are dying for better future, for country with rule of law, strong institutions, and people deserve to see electoral democracy. And I'm sure after victory, there will be presidential, parliamentary, plus local elections. And Ukraine, compared to Russia, so we, for all these 30 years of renewed independence, proved that we have free and fair elections. In Ukraine, it's hard to predict who will become a next president of Ukraine. It's in Russia very clear. But in Ukraine, like we could, with two revolutions and others, it's still. So in this case, really, but regarding corruption, I also kindly asking you to help us to fight corruption, because we have a pro-Russian oligarch, Mr. Firtash, who is sitting in Vienna and waiting for extradition to US for last 8 months. 8 years. And it's still, for me, as a reform-minded person, it's hard to understand why. Instead of being in US and responding for all his corruption cases, he is a representative of Russian interest. He is, for 8 years, he's been, I would say, protected by Austrians. And it's a key when we are talking about fighting with oligarchs. And the war, Russian aggression, is when many oligarchs lost. Like recently, Mr. Akhmetov sold his TV channels because he's afraid of de-oligarchization law and others. So I think it's also important for us to rethink, but without strong support from EU, US, and real tough position on oligarchy. This would be really fight, and I do hope that after Canada, they adopted a bill on confiscation of Russian assets. We will see legislation in US, in the European nations, because it's also important source of money for reconstruction and not just investment and others. So I think it's really important. And you mentioned 7 packages of sanctions adopted by the EU. We're also very thankful, but still sanctions could be even tougher. And it's strange that why UK imposed sanctions against Kirill, who is so-called leader of Orthodox Church, and we are very thankful to UK, but EU didn't do this, and we know why. So we also have to be very to honestly answer on question why. Kirill, who is a part of war machine, who was also undermining all efforts of different countries joining to NATO, like Montenegro and others. So it's a part of Russian hybrid warfare machine. And he is not on the sanction list of the EU and Rosatom. Now, when the representatives of these companies, together with Russian military, attacking Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and Rosatom is not a part of Western sanctions. And military industry and Russian oligarchs, they are trying to buy loyalty. Now there is another great idea of Mr. Friedman. He wants to pay $1 billion to get relief of American sanctions. When I read this article last week in the Wall Street Journal, I was like, really, is it fake, or how the Wall Street Journal could even publish this idea? So these wallets of Putin, like Friedman, Aven, and others, they also contributed to genocide against Ukraine. And now they think that it's very easy to buy US or others just for $1 billion. Does democracy cost $1 billion? So when we are talking about the future of democracy, please help Ukraine also to fight with our oligarchs, not to allow Russian oligarchs to use different holes in just to, how to say, to create a rebirth of Russian empire. Because I think the key, you mentioned, and I saw the reaction of Viola, that we have to defeat Russia first. But I think it's not just about defeat of Russian regime. We have to shift from regime change to how to de-imperialize Russia. Because with the Soviet Union disintegration in 1991, it was the defeat of communism, but not the defeat of colonialism. And this is like in 30 years of period, we've seen another Russian half an empire attacking Chechnya, attacking Georgia, attacking Ukraine. And it's still strange why Wagner Group are not a terroristic organization. So it's also about the question of political will. So there are many tasks when we also expect that we will strengthen a sanction package and we will see unity and we will learn the lessons and with the focus on energy, because it's also, I understand, one of the key important sector, not to allow Russians to blackmail the whole European Union as a geopolitical player.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hopko. Is Ms. Cramon still with us? Okay. Then, Mr. Albrecht, I would like to have a provocative question to you. And I think there is an elephant in the room which wasn't addressed until now today, and this is absorption capacity. And the sheer fact that there are a couple of member states in the European Union which even... Did we also lost him?
I'm here.
Subversive.
Thank you. Then I continue with my question. That we have several member states in the European Union, which even if are not unofficially, but tie the issue of any further enlargement to EU institutional reforms and an extension of the qualitative majority decision making to further areas of EU policies. And we know how hard this nut is to crack, especially because any extension of qualified majority voting needs unanimity in the Council. And then, excuse me, Ms. Cramon, I haven't seen you on the screen, but I'm happy that you are still with us. So then it's a question to both of you. What do you think politically between creating this linkage between EU institutional reform and further enlargement? Ms. Cramon, over to you.
That's a great question, because at least it appears to me that is sometimes being used as an excuse not to go for any further enlargement. I mean, we had the beginning of this discussion for quite some time, and it's rather disappointing for all of us in the European Parliament that almost nothing has happened. The exercise of the Conference for the Future of Europe was, how to say, rather lukewarm when it comes to the ambition of the Commission and also especially the Council. So there was more an election campaign for President Macron than a real, output-orientated convention. I think it would be good to institutionalize this, to really make it more like a commitment from all the EU institutions. Of course, we need to go forward. We need to work on reforms. We have to find a way how to overcome this unanimity challenge and problem and everything else, which was mentioned many times, the numbers of the commissioners and so on, and how to really become a more executive power here. But nevertheless, I think to start an enlargement process with Ukraine, also to intensify the enlargement process with the Western Balkan countries, should not be linked to the domestic reforms or the interinstitutional reforms, because then it will be blocked forever. And then I would see, at least in the Western Balkan states, and I guess Hanna would agree, there is no, inspiring moment for those countries to really work on reform if they, in the end, need to wait until the EU has reformed itself, or the reform has even implemented. But I would object maybe one thing which Mr. András has mentioned, and that is related to, let's say, the abolition of democracy while you're in a war situation. I fully understand that you have to face own security, let's say, threats in the country in a different way than during peace times. But if you, let's say, suspend the most patriotic parties and make their life difficult and really concentrate the power only to the president, even you are a parliamentary democracy, and you create like almost a one-man show, even you see that in wartime, there are so many actors working hand in hand, and Ukraine survives because they have a decentralized state, because they have strong mayors, because they have a strong general commander, because they have good parties in the parliament. But you see, the vertical power is, let's say, really, I mean, almost. It's of course not Russia. I would not dare to compare that. But the last steps which the presidential administration has taken, I think, were not the right ones to really get the majority of the people behind you. And that would, at least, worries me a lot. I understand the military situation is, how to say, ask for different, let's say, structures, but nevertheless, it needs a checks and balances. It needs a better oversight and so on. And especially when we speak about money flowing into the country, that cannot just go from, let's say, more of one institution as it is managed right now.
Thank you, Ms. Cramon. Mr. Albrecht, how do you see the linkage between EU institutional reform and enlargement? You have the floor.
I agree to the point that there shouldn't be a precondition of EU reform linked to the enlargement process. But in the same time, we have to say that a long time it was the other way around, that deepening and reform in the institutions was linked to the fact that we had enlargement and we couldn't process and progress with it. And that would be wrong in the same way as we see, for example, with the point brought forward on the approach to the sanctions, and like how do we approach also in judicial cooperation the role of oligarchs, and how do we enforce coherently our decisions. We need to have more common decisions done in a more effective way in the European Union in order to address these challenges. So deepening of the cooperation on these matters in the European Union is key. And we all know that the success of the European Union as an idea and the structure is bound to stronger integration and reform, and that this needs to be done, and that we still have to fight for that together also, as there are forces in the European Union and in Europe as a whole also trying to get this put on a long bench, or even dismantle the integration which we already achieved in the European Union. So it's both necessary, and therefore it's important to mention both, but there's no precondition to it. On the other hand, I would like to also say that while I'm very much in favor of being really ambitious about the accession procedure and being early with some of the fields being implemented, I agree to the fact that in some of the fields, the road is still ahead of us, and it's a stony road of integration and applying standards which were mentioned also to Ukraine, and implement them on the basis of laws and many measures which needed to be taken. So we shouldn't also send wrong expectations, which also makes it even more problematic if at a certain moment there will be a fatigue on some of the fields. We can see, as I said, some areas where it can be accelerated and where things can be brought forward quicker also, as we have seen that in other accession procedures. But there are fields maybe also regarding, for example, judicial procedures and corruption aspects, where we need to look at things being done in the right way also on long term. And we should be honest about that and do expectation management in a way that there won't be such a fatigue, but be very clear on the fact that this procedure is a very serious one, and that we are not looking at it as a show procedure, which in the end might be ending up in no result, but that we mean it. And that is important also for Ukraine and the perspective we are having together with Ukraine. I have to be honest on that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Albrecht. I still have a long list of questions, but wouldn't like to monopolize the right to ask questions to our speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Q&A is open. Please raise your hands if you have any question and introduce yourself also briefly. I don't know whether we have a walking microphone. Then, please, first Daniel and then the gentleman. There.
Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Barta. I'm president of Center for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy. I would have a question, but first a very short comment, because I'm always tempted in these panels when we are talking about the sanctions and Kirill and Rosatom. The question is that why the US is not doing it. Because if US would do it, we can wait for the Europe forever that we find a solution, but it would be super easy if the United States would put them on the sanction list. Then it would be automatic in the European Union as well, because the companies here would be afraid of doing business with Rosatom. And I'm sure that even local banks in countries such as Hungary would be hesitant to work with Rosatom. But that's just a comment. My question would go for another country, which is there, and we heard a lot that double standards and Western Balkans when it comes to accession, but there is another country who got the candidate status, and that is Moldova. And we talked about the special status of Ukraine and why we should introduce special rules for the accession because of for Ukraine. But would that mean that Moldova would do you think Moldova should automatically negotiate under the same rules? And if not, why not? So that's, I think, a tough question, whether we can handle these countries in a similar way, whether would Moldova receive the similar conditions as Ukraine during this process on the road towards the EU membership? And if not, on what basis we should differentiate?
Thank you, Daniel. I would suggest to gather 3 questions, and then we can make a final round with our speakers. And there were 2 questions there on the right side, the left bank.
Thank you. My name is Tivadar Balázs. I'm a freelancer. And my question is that whether joining the EU Persecution Agency is a prerequisite at the moment for new members, for candidates, and if it is so, if you think that that's a good enough guarantee to avoid big corruption after joining the EU.
Thank you so much. And the last question there on the right side.
I am Murat Hasanov, alumni of CU. I have a question to Mr. András. He told about the accession criteria, but for example, I think that the EU is more political project. For example, Cyprus, yes, the size are different, but Cyprus was divided, but it was accepted, or acceptance of Eastern European countries were more political than, or non-accession of Turkey. Sometimes it's criticized as politically motivated decision rather than economic or other things. What would you think about it? What's your comment on it?
Thank you so much. I would suggest to make a last round, and I would like to ask you to keep your responses concise. So we have had 3 questions. The third one about the roles of borders. in the accession procedure, there was a question to the treatment of Moldova in comparison to Ukraine, and whether membership in the European Public Prosecutor's Office can be conditioned for candidate countries. András, would you mind to start? Because there was a direct question also to you.
Thank you. Regarding Mr. Hassanov's question on Cyprus, Turkey, and all the others, sir, I have no clue. I mean, I'm a Russia specialist, Russia-Ukraine specialist. I know nothing about the accession procedures of the other countries, and I don't want to pretend that I do when I don't. So I'm very sorry. That's the expertise of somebody else. When it comes to Moldova and for a separate track, this is part of the problems. I mean, and particularly when it comes to the 5 years perspective, what to do with Moldova. And personally, I would be against too much segmentation of the accession procedure, because the more we segment, the more separate tracks we create, while all the separate tracks are supposed to lead to the same final direction. So the more we segmentate the accession process, the more complicated our own life becomes. And another argument for not making Moldova an exception is what Mr. Albrecht said, that the accession process is not a TV show. It's not something that we can speed up. No, it's an institutional process. So in the very end, I'm against making too much exceptions for Ukraine as well. And if we don't make exceptions for Ukraine, we shall not make exceptions to Moldova either, which is another argument against further segmentation. And again, instead of, I mean, what Hanna, you said that it's in the Ukrainian constitution that the country's aspiration is full EU and NATO membership. I'm going to be a troll here, but you cannot create a path dependency for the EU from the outside. I mean, imagine North Korea writes into its own constitution. So this is not an argument that functions. Because whatever is in the constitution of a neighboring country, that constitution doesn't affect the European Union. That constitution affects the given country. So instead of using this argument, I would go, and this applies also to Moldova, for a lot more existential arguments. Because people often ask the question what the EU can give to Ukraine. Let me ask the question the other way around. What we can get from Ukraine, and also from Moldova, in the spirit of mutual cooperation and mutual benefits. Labor force. We are on the right track. I mean, if you look at the recent OECD paper on the effects of the Ukrainian asylum seekers coming to Europe, the likely GDP growth, thanks to the asylum seekers, is somewhere between 0.2 or 0.4%. It's substantial. Because many of the Ukrainians who came to Europe will stay and will contribute to our own economy. Here is a benefit. We need the labor force. That's why it's important that we liberalize the visa regimes. That's why we give visa-free travel. And this is something we should pursue further. Agricultural resources, what Hanna said. Ukraine has immense strategically important assets, which we need. So, okay, let's go forward with liberalizing access to the EU agricultural market, because we need Ukraine's agricultural products. And there are a lot more such things. And when we speak about the joint roaming zone for cell phones, it's not only because we are nice to Ukraine, it's also because Ukraine is a fairly big market. So there is the mutual interest here as well. One can define several areas of fully mutual interests where we can deepen cooperation without actually giving Ukraine full membership. So, and the same thing applies to Moldova, on a smaller scale, of course, but the overall logic shall be the same. I hope that goes for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, András. Ms. Cramon? Please feel free to select any of the questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. András' answer was rather provoking, but also very honest. I think it's good to hear a very interest-driven reply for the question of what can Moldova and Ukraine give to the EU. I mean, everything which makes this continent more peaceful, more stable, more, socially coherent would be a benefit for all of us. I mean, you said asylum seekers. I don't think that most of the people coming now bordering the EU are asylum seekers. They are mainly refugees. And if you say that most of them or some of them will stay, yes, I see this, but also with a kind of a crying eye as well, because Ukraine will need them. And they are losing so many people to different sides, and some will never return. But I also do hope that many of them from the EU labor market, even we can need them, they would return. Well, when it comes to Moldova, I actually heard, of course, there will be no split with Ukraine, there will be no separate track. But for Moldova, even they're in a huge economical crisis, and even it is political rather fragile. I mean, they proceed with their reforms, and there would be no need to have let's say, a more cautious track when it comes to Moldova. And Moldova, of course, has the advantage, and that's sorry to say, but it's rather small, and it's very close to Romania, and they have really, I mean, this would be rather easy for the EU to digest. So with Moldova, I have not heard a single voice who would have a problem to say, of course, can manage to include Moldova into the European domestic market. With Ukraine, and I'm absolutely sure we will not give them any discount in terms of criteria. But what we have seen from inside, even during wartime, Ukrainians are willing to reform. And that is, I think, where we have to see how much we can support them. Of course, 5 years is not a realistic period, but nevertheless, you see how many people are working on this accession path. And I think for us, it is important to make sure that Ukrainians have the hope and the realistic belief that in the end, if they implement the reform and if they can deliver on what we had asked them for, they have a real chance to join. And so, I don't know. I mean, the war is overshadowing everything at the moment. We all suffer a lot, as you have rightly said. But in the end, I think from the geostrategical point of view, I think the EU accession will be crucial. Otherwise, Ukraine will always be the target of the bigger neighbor, I'm pretty sure.
Thank you, Ms. Cramon. Mr. Albrecht?
Yeah, to make sure I'm short, I'm agreeing with a lot of things being said, and I really think that, of course, we all know that this all is a political project, but it is also based on treaties and principles and a lot of very detailed standards built up after years and decades. And that, of course, the accessions procedures today cannot be compared with several moments in the past in the same way. But we also see that reform can be done. Accession procedures can be accelerated on the basis of the understanding that, of course, the criteria have to be met in a certain way. And that is the important part. We have to support those on the track in the best way possible. And the European public prosecutors and other structures, that's important. It's a crucial element to fight corruption and organized crime in Europe. But it's not like sufficient in the end to only do that, because there's far more when you look at independent judicial procedures at independent courts and also police and law enforcement measures which need to be done. So that's key to work on that. And we're working on that also inside the European Union. We all know that we need those things to be built up, and we should do our best in order to support those institutions and infrastructure to be built up, and look at the realistic perspective on what we can achieve and in which time, but not lay back and wait or politically underestimate the geopolitical role, as Viola said, this all plays.
Thank you so much, Mr. Albrecht. And before I would give the floor to Ms. Hopko to hold the closing words, I just in a minute would like to address the question related to the European Public Prosecutor's Office. EPPO is a so-called enhanced cooperation, which means that it's not obligatory for EU member states, and therefore it also cannot be set as a condition for candidate countries. However, Ukraine could ask for a permission to join the European Public Prosecutor's Office. And as a matter of fact, this could definitely mitigate, for example, donors' concerns when it comes to reconstruction donations to the Ukraine. The German Marshall Fund, we published just at the beginning of September a document called Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And this was one of our core recommendations, that there should be an opportunity for a voluntary participation of Ukraine, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, because that could be a solution for a transparent reconstruction process. And based on our European legal investigations, from a legal perspective, it's possible. And having said that, Ms. Hopko, your closing words.
Thank you so much. What I would like to say, that in Ukraine we do respect what is written in our constitution. So if it's written membership, it means membership perspective. And I don't know how it's in the EU, because Ukraine is just moving to the EU membership. But I'm sure that treaties, principles, standards, it really means a lot. So if Ukraine meet Copenhagen criteria and all association treaties, it will be in the benefit. So please do not create some other desirable, not desirable. Membership is about membership. And actually, it's a key for us. And please also do respect, because I know that other countries who are now members of European Union, they also incorporated into their constitution the membership perspective. So nothing new we invented, but actually, I would like to say that Russian genocide against Ukraine, it's also one of the problems of the whole Western civilization, because the man-made famine organized by Stalin in last century wasn't properly condemned, and actually the communist regime wasn't really punished. So, and now we are facing the genocide. We are paying the highest price. And to talk today about that Ukraine is a donor of labor force. Ukraine is a great having resources like agriculture. But besides agriculture, God blessed Ukraine for other like critical raw materials, which are key for future industries. But we are here not to talk about resources. If EU is just about trade, or about how to contribute and make wealthier and prosper. So I'm not sure I want to be a part of such European Union. It's not about values, sorry. We are dying not just to be donor of European Union. We are dying just to be equal partner, to be member in family. Being in family, it doesn't mean that one son is good, second is better or others. So everyone should be considered as an equal partner. And we are ready to contribute, but actually to strengthen European security, to bring more prosperity and others. But I think the key is here to consider Ukraine as a spiritual basket, as a moral authority, which is actually helping to return Europe, not just to trade. We've already seen Nord Stream 2 and many other projects. And actually the genocide against Ukraine, it's also a part of double standards of the EU. Because for many 8 years, instead of preventing wars, there were not sanctions enough to stop Russia from organizing this genocide. So actually, I do believe that in 2, in 5, and 3, so I think we have to work on both directions, making you also attractive and also helping Ukraine to meet this criteria. And then this will be for the future generations, and actually being a geopolitical player. It doesn't mean just security, the modern weapon and other. It's also about values. And values for me personally first, then trade, economy and other things.
Thank you, Ms. Hopko. I wanted to say that join me in applauding our speakers, but you was much faster. So thank you so much for the food for thought we received from you today. And ladies and gentlemen, also many thanks for your attention, and have a nice evening. Bye.